Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started this afternoon. So, pass around the sign-in sheet. So, what we're going to do today, we're going to pick up from just a little bit of fragment of material that we didn't get to in the section dealing with market failure. That was the issue of types of goods. And we talked a little bit about this. Is something I said earlier in the semester that we'd be circling back to this a bit later because we had additional kinds of goods onto this because when we started out, we said, okay, we've got these types of goods, and we're going to call these dichotomous pairs. And then goods for which they present their opposite. So we put substitutes and complements together. That's what we call dichotomously paired. That is, they're opposite one another. And we also say normal goods and inferior goods. We're going to add a couple more pairs to that today because we're going to sort of pick up a bit more with this concept. The market failure is really a pretty critical bit of micro focus, and there's been a lot of, in fact, a lot of microeconomics you might think of as being an area that doesn't grow. And that's probably true. You could probably pick up a micro textbook from the 1980s, and it's probably just as current now as it was then. It with exception of the fact that there's a little more appreciation for the idea of market failure. And that's one area that's really growing in terms of new learning, new thought, new research. And of course, when we talked about one of the big ones, there's a reason why we focused specifically on the issue of externalities last week. And that was because of the fact that externalities are so critical to our understanding of the way that markets sometimes don't always work efficiently. Okay, so we're going to talk about that, and we're going to add a bit of nuance to that. We're going to, and obviously remember that when we talked about market failure, we also talked about the fact that government may or may not have a role to play, depending upon your particular point of view. And so we'll talk about different points of view on that. We're also going to circle back to chapter 4. Now, I had omitted this earlier, and you might want to read it. You might. It's not what I'm going to talk about here is basically what's covered in the book, with the exception of the financial piece. One of the reasons why I thought it was best to sort of skip this was, number one, in my own opinion, I thought it was kind of weirdly placed in the text. I thought chapter 4 coming around to chapter 3, because chapter 3 is really just sort of transitioning us into micro. And then I thought it'd be better to hold off on labor until we sort of get through some of the, and I think it pairs up better in chapter 14, which I think is sort of natural follow on. So I think that's the direction we want to go. That's why we skipped it earlier on. And I'm not going to go into the financial part of it because the other concern I had was not only was the placement within the textbook, which, people can disagree. It's not a huge deal. I'm not, saying it's a bad textbook because it's not. We wouldn't be using it if it were bad. But I think it's oddly placed. Plus the discussion of finance and financial market demand and supply, I think is really not necessary for what we're doing. And the only part of finance that we sort of intersect with is going to come a bit later when we get to chapter 16, which is also sort of a carry-on. And this idea of market failure will sort of run as a thread throughout what we're doing. Okay, when we come back on Wednesday, we'll talk a bit more about some of the specifics in chapter 14, specifically dealing with unequal sort of market relationships between buyers and sellers of labor. That's buyers being employers, sellers being workers, and where you'll sometimes see, if you wonder why wage inequalities happen, that's one explanation. It's certainly not the only explanation. In fact, there's lots of discussion about wage discrimination, and so we, if time permits, we'll get into that as much as we can. And I think you'll find that to be a fairly interesting chapter, particularly in terms of discussing what some of the basics are of wage differentials. Okay. All right. So questions. Go ahead.
Final.
The next test is exam 4.
Exam 4. So we have 2 more tests.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Exam 4. So now you had indicated you wanted to go over the exam. Did you want to talk about specific questions, or did you want to go over all questions? Because I can do either or. It doesn't really matter.
I would love to have all of the because I
okay.
do that well.
Because I release the answers usually, and I know there is whenever you do a trade-off, no one, you can't please everybody, but I allow a week's makeup period after exam just because our students are busy and whatnot. So I usually don't release the answers right away for that week-long period. Let's wait till next week once the makeups are done. I know there's at least one that's in this section that's happening when the exam's not done.
And where would you release your
Okay,
answers?
so I think we went over that. And your view is a little bit different than mine. Did you know how to get that to her? Did you show her how to get to that?
I believe it has to be next week once you release.
Yeah,
it.
and it'll say completed exam.
And then there's a little sidebar.
Okay.
That you'll see.
And I don't have, and I apologize for that. I'm sorry, I can't answer how to get, because your view is different than mine, so I don't know exactly what yours looks like, but
And all the previous tests.
those should be
do
available.
this.
They should be available. Yeah. They should be available. And I mean, they're not, these are not like,
It's going to be a great, that's the easy,
I know.
the great. And when you scroll down, you just push on whatever is down.
discussion.
Yeah.
Okay, so I know a lot of instructors don't like to release their exams and keep them out there forever. These are not recycled. I create these at every case.
What's the right answer is.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Okay.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll have the exam questions. Okay, so that's, well, I'll make those, I'll make that available. So Mondays, I'm gonna make a note here. So Monday's class, that'd be 4-3. Talk about exams, okay, and I can go over that, and that's fine. I know that sometimes some people want to see it, some don't, and but we've got plenty of time. We really do, and I've said before that I'm not really worried about us being able to get through the 9 chapters that we're going to cover. So we should be fine. So I'll do that. I'll go over that. Some people don't like it. Some would just rather see it and say, okay, here's the, okay, if I have questions, I'll deal with it. So, but that's perfectly fine. I'm okay with that. Okay. So Monday we'll do that. And if you have any questions about the previous 2 exams, let me know about that as well. So have a chance to look those over. I'll be more than glad to talk about anything. Okay. Okay, so we're going to talk about types of goods, and we're going to sort of work our way sort of back to chapter 4, but it's not going to be the financial part of that. The main issue in chapter 14, which is still sort of an issue really of market failure. Now, remember, when we talk about market failure, what is it and what is the definition? So this was up from, and I'll post these. I've got some PowerPoints I'll post. I was looking this morning, and I need to do a little bit of revision on some of these, and so I've got to post the rest of your material for this week anyway. Bright Spaces. I thought, well, let me just sort of revise some of these I've got, and some of these I want to sort of put in a little bit better order. But we talk about market failure. You should have. I'm sure I've already viewed this. This goes back to week 10, and obviously we're week 12 right now. But all I want to do is just sort of circle back to this sort of general, broad topic of what's known as market failure. It's the idea, it's the concept that private actors, left to their own devices, simply always allocate efficiently the output and throughout the economy, or it's not fairly distributed, or it's not in general public interest. The term public interest is obviously in the eye of the beholder, and we can all disagree over what the public interest is. And that's one of the challenges that economists have and policymakers in general have, is what is the public interest? Do we have a public interest in getting rid of all of these bads and bringing them all the way down to zero? That is, do we have a public interest in reducing pollution to zero? We have an interest in reducing property crime to zero. It may not be economically feasible, it may not even be feasible, period, to do that. But when we do that, the more that we try to bring something down to zero, the greater the cost goes up. And so something else has to give. And so this is why we tolerate certain things like pollution. And I know that the cap and trade thing that we talked about last week, where firms that pollute are allowed to sell their emission rights to others. It might seem like, well, we're giving a license to those to do things which we know are bad, but it's really a recognition. I think it's really sort of a grown-up view of the idea that there are going to be bad things. We want to put a limit on those bad things, bring them down over time, because that's part of the goal. But then those who are more efficient at getting rid of those bads can actually make money, can be incentivized. And if you view the idea of economics as being incentives that create people's willingness to do certain things in their own particular interest, particularly the private sector, which that really defines the private sector, then we can say that that might be a successful way to go. Obviously, government's got a role to play, because sometimes no other actor can do the kind of things that only government can do. But then the question is, what is the public interest as defined by the government? And that could change very often. I mean, when we talk about monopoly and antitrust law, that changes, particularly based upon politics. There's absolutely no question about it. And I said early on in class, it's almost impossible to pull economics apart from politics, but we talked about monopoly, the idea of dealing with monopoly formation, that it does seem like you have the Bush administration under George W. Bush was much more lenient in terms of big business combinations. President Obama came in, was a little bit less lenient. Then President Trump came in, was very lenient on this topic. So it kind of ebbs and flows. And so when we talk about policy, we're talking about the fact that these are political decisions that are often made that impact the economic realm. And so that's something that we can't pull out of the mix. So, and I don't want to go back all this slide here because we went through it before, but I want to talk about this idea that we said, what are some examples of this sort of umbrella topic called market failure? And we talked a bit about collusive practices, but we talked last week about spillovers or externalities. We're talking about public goods today and what they are. We're also going to talk about free riders. And then as we get a little bit later in the course, we'll talk about information failures. And there's something called information economics, which deals with this idea that information itself is not widely disseminated or oftentimes inadequately distributed. Is interesting to talk about, so we'll come back to that. Okay. All right. So, any questions about any of that? That's where we're going, what we're doing. Okay. Well, let's talk about some new stuff here. I'll post these as I get going a little bit later today. So, okay. So back, I don't know what week 2 maybe, we talked about types of goods, and we said these are dichotomous pairs, substitutes and complements. What are they? Obviously, we could go back and talk about substitutes being one good that can be swapped out for another, mostly due to price. Complements are goods that go in the same direction. You buy hamburgers, you probably go buy hamburger buns, or hot dogs, hot dog buns. Shoes and socks, toothbrushes and toothpaste, they go in the same direction. But they're opposite. You can't be a substitute and also be a complement. The same goes to normal goods and inferior goods. We said the normal goods are those goods for which the demand is positively connected to income, correlated with income. If incomes go up, people demand more of these goods. If incomes go down, they demand less. Inferior goods, just the opposite. And so you can't be an inferior good and also be a normal good because it doesn't make sense. Having said that, one of the things that we said was there's no fencing because all inferior goods are substitutes. So you could be an inferior substitute, you could be a normal complement, you could be a normal substitute. So there's no fencing in, you just can't be opposite of what you're set up with. Okay, so that's how we initially determined those. And by the way, when we got into the question of elasticity in chapter 5, we actually had elasticity measures that you may recall that measured the strength of these relationships. This was cross-price elasticity. That is, if the price of beef goes up, what happens to the demand for hamburger buns, right? That would be an example of cross-price elasticity. That is measuring the degree of sensitivity of that one good to the change in the price of another good. Okay, so there was a way that we could measure the strength of that relationship in terms of complements or substitutes, whichever you want to talk about. Normal goods, we talked about this as being income elasticity. That is, okay, so we said that normal goods are those goods that they're called normal because they behave in a way that we would expect. So if incomes go up by 5%, how much does demand increase for these goods? And so that's really the question, measures the strength of those. Okay, and so income elasticity measures that. All right, we're going to now add a couple of additional goods here. We got another pair that will add a bit later. The first one we're talking about is private goods and public goods. So let's talk about what these are. I mentioned these just a little bit, so we need to really define what these are. And we're sort of picking up a little bit of what we didn't get to back in the 12-13. I can think of chapters 12 and 13 of Texas, but really being one chapter. I know the author's kind of broken out because I think they wanted to focus a lot on the negative externalities in chapter 12. But included this whole idea of market failures, the idea of private and public goods. So what are they? Okay, well, let's talk about private goods. Up to now, pretty much all the goods we've been talking about are private goods. That is, goods produced by private sellers or private buyers. And it doesn't really matter so much who the buyer is because we know government is also a buyer and governments in the public sector. It's more who produces the goods and why. So if you're talking about a private producer of a good, look around the room and everything that you see here is probably produced by some sort of private entity, whether it's that table, that chalkboard, those light fixtures, whatever. They're produced by some entity that does what in the private sector. They're seeking to engage in maximizing behavior. It's a business firm that's trying to maximize profit. Well, not all the goods that are out there we know are private goods because we have a need for public goods. And that is, there are some, in the definition of a public good, some good that only government can provide because only government has the authority or the economic incentive to produce the good in the first place. Think about public streets, for instance. Who would build a street and why? And if you did it, how would you recover the cost of doing that? I'm not saying there aren't streets that are built, particularly on private facilities and private land. It does have streets and roads and infrastructure and whatnot. But if it's not private, if it's public land, then who's going to create a street and why would you do it? By the way, this goes back really, this creation of public goods and why we have them and who should pay for them. These are really, really old arguments that go all the way back really to the beginning of the United States. And there are a number of court cases that were pretty notable for the idea that there are people who wanted to build particularly bridges. And there was one notable case called the Charles River Bridge Company, where you built a bridge across the Charles River from Boston to Cambridge and wanted to charge people passage to get across that. And it was a big hullabaloo. It's like, what do you mean? You're going to charge us to cross the bridge to get from one locality to another locality? Otherwise, we have to drive all the way around the bay and all that. And so, I mean, can you imagine if we did that all the time? And this was a private company. This was not a toll road that you pay to the state of Massachusetts. This was a private toll. And eventually that whole thing got resolved, but another bridge was built by the government in order to weaken the power of that. And then the private owners of the original bridge said, wait a minute, government, you're trying to take a piece of the action from us, and that's not how do we recover our cost and all that. So these are long running debates as to public goods versus private goods, and what goods should be which. Should we call bridges across waterways public or private? And I think in most cases, we've concluded that these are public goods. Whether there's a toll being paid or not, the toll is sort of a nominal charge. Usually, although I know there are some toll roads that are a little bit more than nominal charges. I think the New Jersey toll roads are a little bit more costly than some others. But and I don't think we don't have any toll roads at all in New Mexico, do we? I know I've never seen a toll road ever. I don't think Texas has any that I'm aware of. Oklahoma has a lot of toll roads.
Texas has.
Does Texas have them?
Oh, yeah.
Does Texas have toll roads? I know they don't make it. And I figured out a way to get protected. I know Oklahoma's got them. You can't even drive across Oklahoma, I don't think, if you go left or right, west to east, or vice versa without crossing toll roads. So they're there, but they're kind of nominal, really. I mean, yeah, they're not zero, but they're kind of nominal. And mostly it's because there's no profit being built into the equation. And that's really what we're talking about when we talk about private goods, is there's got to be some sort of profit motive, or else why do it? Now we see this play out all the time, this conflict that exists between what goods should be private, what goods should be public. And it goes to all kinds of things. There's a privatization effort that's been going on for a very long time in this country. And that is the idea that there are some goods that are provided by government that some believe that maybe should be provided by the private sector. And there's no area that sort of leaps out larger than incarceration, private for-profit prisons that have been set up. And they're very controversial in a lot of ways. And those who believe that government can't do anything right, they charge too much, they're inefficient, take care of business, I'll leave it to the private sector because the private sector inherently is better at cost control. I think that's a really tenuous argument, particularly when it comes to private incarceration, because we've seen issues and problems there. Notably, the one case in which there was a judge being paid off by the private company to incarcerate people, it was teenagers. And there was one teenage student who was arrested, thrown in a private jail, posting something on Facebook about a principal and whatnot, which I'm not even sure what crime that constitutes. You know, maybe it's not the smartest thing to do, but you can see that if there's private incentive, and I'm not saying there's no kickbacks going on in the public sector, but this is something that inherently was corrupting because of the fact that there's money being made, lots of money being made. And so do you want to incentivize private entities to create something which is not desirable, but is necessary? Same goes with police forces. Do we want private police forces? How does that work in your private police force? You get a dispute with your neighbor and you call your cops, he calls his cops. I mean, how does that really work? I don't understand what the mechanism is. And I know that first fire departments in this country were private fire departments. Then it turns out that wasn't such a great idea. And basically how it worked, I think Benjamin Franklin was the originator, where you had to have like a medallion that was like a fixed piece of metal that was affixed to the outside of your house. And so if your house was on fire, they would come try to put your fire out. But if you didn't have that, well, sorry, that's the way fires happen, you know, oh well. And yet it was a subscription service. The problem with it is, though, that if you go to fire, it doesn't contain itself to your house. It could burn down an entire block, it could burn down an entire city. We've seen that happen before. So really, we don't know that privatization of fire is probably not the best thing. Even though there are some that exist in some rural areas. And in fact, there was a story that a few years ago, I think it was in Pennsylvania, a very rural area, where there was a house caught on fire, and the local fire department said, it's not our jurisdiction. We'd like to come, but we really can't. We're busy doing other things. There's a volunteer fire department that said it's not really in our jurisdiction. And so, I mean, I know that we get into some of these issues, and I know fire departments will try to help each other out. But if they're already busy, then there's question over who's who. That's a bit of a problem, and it would only be magnified if you have private sector involvement. So that's really the issue here between private. So I kind of gave you a bit of examples there, but I really want to sort of point out the fact this is not just textbook stagnation, stagnant sort of theory, but these are real life things that are playing out at the present time, and we see this in all kinds of different areas. You know, I know when I lived in Indiana before I came here, the governor there wanted to have lunch service at all the facilities, state government facilities provided for by the private sector. And it sort of worked out, sort of didn't work out, and you have to really determine whether or not that's the case. And sometimes they do work out. And in fact, I can tell you that whenever I get my license renewed or get my plates or whatever, I always go to MVD Express. And it's a little bit more, but it's faster. And I've had just nightmarish experiences with the license branches themselves. And so, yes, we know that the public sector sometimes does not react to incentives the way that private sector actors do. I think it's just a fact. I mean, I've gone to license branches before where, you're standing in line, suddenly somebody closes their window, it's time for lunch, off they go to lunch. But then everyone else is there because they're at lunch. And so you've got to go confident whose lunch is more important. I guess it's the government employees' lunch is more important, right? You probably wouldn't see that as much with private sector actors. So I get the argument. The argument's an important one, and I think that it's something that it goes on, and there's no easy answer. And so I don't mean to suggest that there is an easy answer. The point I want to make though is it's something that it goes on, and it's probably a never-ending debate. Now, when we talk about private and public goods, we need to talk about how we define these, because the example I gave you of private producers is sort of incomplete in a lot of ways. And that is the idea we've got some additional criteria by which we measure is it a private good or public good. And then there are two other definitions as well that we need to get into, and we'll give you some definitions on that and some examples. But there are two main criteria, and it's important not to get confused over what these criteria are. The criteria are rivalry and excludability. Rivalry and excludability. I know sometimes these are difficult to, and I know people mix these up, and so I want to focus particularly on excludability because I think that's the big issue. First of all, let's take these in order. Rivalry. So up to this point, when we talk about rivalry, it seems like all we've really talked about is rivalry among sellers, particularly since we just emerged from this market structure section of the class. We said we got these monopolies, they're out there, they have no rivals, they're doing great, they have the ability to set output and price and so whatnot. Perfect competition, lots of rivalries and lots of fighting amongst themselves. That's rivalry among sellers. This is rivalry among buyers, and this is an element that we really haven't talked about much before. That is, to what degree are buyers of goods in competition with other buyers? And to the extent that only one good can be used by one party at a time, it means that it's basically what we would call a zero-sum game. And by the way, zero-sum games refer to this whole idea of game theory, which is got all kinds of different applications in microeconomics. So if you ever take a 300-level micro course, you'll probably get into that. And it's the idea of who wins and who loses. And a zero-sum game is where somebody wins and somebody loses, and either you're one up or you're one down. And they together, the one up and one down sum to zero. That's why it's called a zero-sum game. Sports is designed to be a zero-sum game, and that is the idea that one team wins, one team loses. I know in some sports there's a tie, and I think a lot of fans of these sports think that's unsatisfactory. They have to fight it out until one wins, and I think there's probably a good point to be had. But you get the idea that there's the idea one good can be used at a given time. So think about this. Now you might say, I know that occasionally people say, well, what do you mean one good at a time? Aren't all goods what we call rivalrous goods? I mean, if I buy a cup of coffee and I'm excluding you from drinking that cup of coffee, I'm not excluding you from going to Starbucks and getting your own cup of coffee, but I'm saying this cup of coffee is my cup and you can't have it's mine, right? Okay, that's true, but it's also at a given time, right? And I don't, well, first of all, I don't lock you out from getting your own cup, but it's also at a given time. If I get seat 21A on an airplane from here to Los Angeles, when I get off that seat, 21A is available for somebody else. And so it's rival in the sense that I'm not sharing that seat with anybody on my flight, but that seat will be used again. So at a given time, that it is rivalrous. On the other hand, goods which are non-rival is where there is no rivalry among buyers, because we can all sort of share in the good, whatever that good in question is, right? So when it comes to something like calling the police, if I call the police, I don't exclude you from calling the police if something happens. Now, obviously, if they're tied up, it may be a while, and of course, we hear horror stories about that. Cops not getting there in time, they have to sort of juggle the priorities. But I'm not locking you out because of the concept of rivalry. My use of the police force does not diminish your use. And that's really what's going on. So that's what rivalry is, it's among buyers. What about excludability? What does excludability refer to? It's the degree which non-payers can be prevented from using the goods. So we're talking. Let's talk a bit about this idea of excludability. Sometimes excludability sometimes seems like it should be the definition for rivalry. Just think about the idea of payment. That's really the issue here. If you focus on the idea of payers and non-payers, then I think that's what the issue of excludability is. So just like the question with rivalry, where it's tempting to say, well, what good do I have to share with anybody else? I don't share a lot of goods with people, except you do. You share the police force, you share the fire department, you share the streets, you share you share a public park, whatever. So you do share goods. And you might say, well, what goods don't I pay for? Well, there are a lot of goods that you don't have to pay for. And that would be some of the examples I just talked about before. If I call the police because someone's trying to break into my house, they're not looking me up and saying, hey, you didn't pay your taxes, so we're not coming. It doesn't work that way. There's no expectation of payment. So to the extent that we don't have to pay for some good, we have free ridership. Okay. Now let's talk a bit about free riders. Your text is, I think your text is a good discussion, the concept of free ridership. And I want to point out what these are, because I know sometimes we hear the term free riders. I know that having done this for a while, and a lot of people will say free riders, they are sort of synonymous with freeloaders, that they're getting something for nothing. They're cheapskates, they're gaming the system, whatever. Well, maybe that is true, and maybe there are that would be included free riders, but that's not really what the overall definition of free riders are. Free riders are simply anybody who gets the benefit of a good without cost to themselves. Okay, and that's a free ridership. And there are all kinds of free ridership activities that go on. And by the way, whether it's in the public or private sector, if you were invited to a wedding, for instance, and you go to the wedding and maybe you bring a gift, maybe you don't. Nobody's going to say, hey, you can't come to the wedding because you didn't bring a gift. I mean, I suppose it probably happened once or twice, but you're there, you can have dinner, enjoy the music and all that. And you're not buying a ticket to go to the wedding necessarily. So that's an example of a private sector example of that. And I know it's interesting that there was a whole movie about that whole wedding crasher thing that was done a few years ago. And I've been to a number of weddings, and it's like, who's this person? And when my daughter was married, some guy was there, and somebody said they saw him at another wedding, and he was invited to. So it's like, I guess that's a real thing. Is a lot of wedding crashers. Yes, that's an example of free rider, but that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about the idea that you can get the benefit of something without paying the cost of it. And it's mostly with the idea of public goods that we're talking about free riders. The example of wedding is a private sector example. Yes, they're out there, they're probably not as common, but free ridership very definitely is common. And that's the idea. I can get some benefit of something without cost to myself, or it's difficult to put the cost onto the use of the good. So for instance, there have been efforts over a very long time period to try to take every public good, that is every government agency, every service provided by government, whether it's federal, state, local, at the school district level, and say, okay, this is what the benefit to me is. Therefore, I should pay this cost because otherwise I'm not getting any benefit. Why should I pay that cost? And we see these sort of tax protests go on again and again and again, and it never really works because of the logic. I mean, in the minds of those who make these arguments, they think they're being perfectly logical. The problem is they're sort of ignoring the idea of free ridership and the idea of excludability in general. Most public goods, you can't exclude people from use. And so we simply collect from everybody for that. And I know that there are occasionally people who refuse to pay property tax because the majority of property tax in most localities goes toward public schools. And somebody could make the argument, hey, my kids are grown, or what we've definitely seen, particularly in the part of the country where I come from, and a lot of us are Catholic and a lot of us went to private school, where, hey, my kids go to private, we're paying for a private school, why should we also pay for a public school? That argument a lot. And it's this double dipping. Well, it doesn't really work because it's someone's choice to make. And to the extent anybody can send their child to a public school, they are essentially free riders. But we don't think of them as being, because this is a service provided for the public because they are goods that the private sector may or may not do a good job at supplying. And there are some private schools that simply have not made it over time, simply because of the fact they just cannot act, they can't cover the cost of operation. Okay, so that's really an issue with regard to free riders. One other example, people, is we've seen this happen a lot where people refuse to pay a portion of their income tax when they say, hey, I object to the war in Iraq, for instance. We saw that happen on a couple of occasions. So therefore, the federal portion of the federal budget that goes toward the war in Iraq is X%. So therefore, we're going to lower our tax by X%, therefore this is enough, we're not supporting it. Doesn't work that way. You don't get to vote. That's, you don't get to choose the cost and benefit that apply to you directly. So this is obviously controversial, and whenever taxes are involved, there's controversy. There's no simple way around it. Okay. All right. So let's talk a bit about rivalry and excludability. Before we do that, though, I want to bring in a couple more ideas here, and that is another set of pairs of goods, and that is the idea of what we call common goods and the output of natural monopolies. Okay. Now, you want to get familiar with this idea of rivalry and excludability, in particular, in the sense that we're going to be creating another one of our a 4-quadrant matrix where we're going to set rivalry and excludability up against the types of goods. So, and we're going to determine the types of goods. We're going to find what those are. So let me sort of swivel the camera here so we can make our discussion and be able to talk about that. So let me move the camera here a bit. Hopefully you guys can see that on the video. Okay, so again, rival are those goods which are, a good is rival if it can only be used by one user at a time. Non-rival if it's not the case, if more than one person can use it. So a non-rival good will be if I go to the beach and you go to the beach, my going to the beach doesn't prevent you from going to the beach, right? Now, obviously, sometimes they have limits and they say, okay, we can only have 5,000 people or whatnot. That's more of a technical issue. It's a capacity issue than it is a type of good kind of issue. Okay. There are goods that are excludable and not excludable. If I go to Starbucks and say I'd like a cup of coffee, I really don't want to pay for it. Do I have to pay for it? Excludable good. If you don't want to pay, you don't get the good, right? Okay, but there are other goods that are not excludable. I send my child to a public school. They're not charging us to do that. It's not excludable, and there's no way they can prevent me from going, whether I paid my taxes or not. I can send my child to a public school. So that's not excludable. So let's talk about this idea of rival versus non-rival. And sometimes you see this as what's known as rivalrous. That's just an adjective that sort of is used to describe rival. Rivalrous just kind of sounds a little bit odd. So I just go with rival or non-rival. Goods which are rival and non-rival, and goods which are excludable and non-excludable. Okay. So I'm going to set these up in a little bit of a matrix here. And so we're going to talk about the types of goods. And I know that we've got these sort of listed on this PowerPoint slide, but here I think it's probably a better idea. Sometimes it's better to sort of see what the examples are. It's one thing for me to talk about it and just sort of go on verbally, but let's give some examples of what these kind of goods are that are non-excludable, non-rival, et cetera. So we've got different sort of combinations of these. Okay. All right. Well, let's take the very first one here. These goods which are rival and goods which are excludable. That's good. All right, what we call private goods, okay? Excuse me, private goods. And so we talk about private goods. These are pretty much all the goods which we talked about up until this point, with the exception of where government has fit into the picture and provided specific goods like the military and whatnot. So the examples, I could give you an example. The list is in the millions, tens of millions. It's counting. It's shoes, cars, clothes. It's it's gasoline, it's insurance, it's all kinds, it's you name it, services, haircuts, pedicure, whatever you want to put in that list. It's all these things which you go to a private seller to get. And as if you're getting a haircut, right, that particular seller of the haircut is only doing your hair at one time, not somebody else's. Although I guess it depends on where you go. I've seen people jump around and do more than one at a time, but theoretically it's one at a time, and it's excludable. If you don't pay, you don't get the service. Okay. Now, one thing I want to say about excludability, because I know that sometimes people they get these terms confused, and it's understandable. I get it, but I know sometimes people think of goods which are not as including goods which are stolen, and that's not really the case, because stolen goods, obviously, there's a way to account for the value of stolen goods, and we certainly do that a lot in the accounting world. But we're saying that if you shoplift a TV set from Target, right? That doesn't make that good non-excludable, which is something that means you've broken the law, and the transaction was intended for it to be an excludable good. You won't get it unless you pay. So I want to make clear, because sometimes we hear free ridership or non-excludability, we get the idea that there's some sort of disreputable behavior going on, and so that does not really include shoplifting or stealing of goods. That does happen, but that's more of an issue that's really a seller's issue, to be honest with you. The burden is on the seller to try to make sure that doesn't happen. And free ridership, we're making the case that it's not tantamount to free loaders because it is something that most of us are free riders all the time. And if I get on the street and go home, when I leave, I'm going to be on university going to my house. I'm not paying anybody. I'm not, but I do have to share the road with others. I can't say, get off the road while I go home. It'd be nice if I could do that, right? But I'm sure, but I'm not paying. And maybe I have never paid taxes ever. And maybe I don't owe taxes. And so how do you apply the cost? So private goods, I won't even attempt to sort of get into this idea of trying to put those together because there are just so many and we all know the examples, okay? What about goods which are non-rival, non-excludable? These are the opposite goods. So we can kind of come to the opposite part of the matrix and talk about these as public goods, okay? So I've talked about some examples of these already, and they're pretty numerous, okay? Unrivaled, non-excludable. It may include things like police and fire emergency services. Now, interestingly, because of the sort of quirky healthcare system we've got, ambulances typically are not non-excludable goods. We typically have to pay for ambulances, and so that's a little bit different, and healthcare in general. So that's something we've got a little bit of a different concept here. So we do, so not all societies have the same sort of connection to involving government in certain transactions. In this case, though, police and fire, no question about the fact we don't have private police forces or private fire departments. Generally speaking, I know that there are probably some exceptions, particularly with fire, but certainly in police, can't imagine any private police force and how that would work. So police and fire, we're talking also about public education certainly fits into this category, no question about it. And we're primarily talking here about K through 12 that tends not to have tuition. You could say that CNM and UNM are public education. Yeah, we sort of are, but well, higher education is a little bit different. The cost structure is different. It's entirely different mission, and people do have to pay. So that is an excludable good in that regard. So I would mostly say when we talk about public education, we're really talking primarily about K through 12. Okay, and we're talking about public, not private education. And this is one area that we do allow, obviously, private provision of that good, but then it becomes an excludable good. So if I send my child to Albuquerque Academy, then I obviously have to pay the cost. If I don't pay the cost, he doesn't go. Okay, but if I send him to a private school, a public school, he does not pay. Okay, so public goods, public education, also things like streets, highways. And I know toll roads are sometimes a little bit of a complicating factor. And so sometimes when we say highways, we're talking about non-toll highways. What's interesting about highways is that the toll, this is an interesting situation with tolls because it reminds me a lot of the discussion about certain states that don't have state income tax codes because they're really seeking to capture the tax from outsiders. Florida, for instance, has no state income tax. And they get a lot of tax from the sale of merchandise from people who are visiting Florida or going to Disney World or paying for hotels. If you live in Florida, you're probably less likely to stay in a hotel than if you are somebody who's from New York and is going to Disney World for a week or whatever. It's an example of that. And the same is set up with tolls to the extent that they're really designed to capture primarily non-residents and have them pay the cost of the particular good in question. And in some localities, you can either get a much reduced toll or no toll at all if you have a little badge or sticker on your car and you can just go right through. That sort of thing. So, yeah. Okay. I know there's an easy pass system in New York and whatnot. So non-toll highways in general, streets and all that, that seems to be that. And we also talk about also public administration, which is just too numerous to go into here. And it's not really necessary that I get into it. This is the alphabet soup of agencies, both the federal and state, that we depend upon to do certain things, whatever those things are. And these are things that there's no. Remember, we talked about market failure. We said one of the attributes of market failure was the idea that sometimes that private actors don't do things because there's no incentive to do them, and they don't do it very efficiently. If we did allow them to do it. So who on earth would do research into things like crop yields and things like insecticides and whatnot, if not for something like the Department of Agriculture that would do that? Or who would do things like monitor trade flows among countries, so to get an idea of how better to inform our Treasury Department as to currency administration, things like that. There's no private actor. What private actor would you ever think would dream of when you attempt to do that? We have public administration do it because it's non-rival activity. if they do it, by the way, if they do it, there's no overlap. Well, there's a lot of overlap sometimes. So it kind of tells you there's that. And by the way, there's lots of overlap too in this area here, particularly when it comes to law enforcement, because in law enforcement, you've got overlapping agencies and whatnot, but that doesn't make them rivalrous. It just means there's overlap, and that means they're non-rival. It sort of supports the idea that they're non-rivalrous in that particular notion. So public administration, and again, how would you, for any individual household, what the value of the EPA is to your household? I have no idea going about how you would go about doing it. There's just no way that I could, on earth, that I could think of what the cost and benefit analysis would be to my household and the existence of the EPA. When do I ever even come into contact with EPA? I get no correspondence with them, I don't talk to them, but we know they're there. I have to pay my taxes, and that's a bit about it. But taxes do have a very tenuous connection to the benefit they provide. Okay. So public administration is one, and also national defense is a big one. And if you've taken our macro course, and we get into a section where we sort of get into the numbers as to what we spend at the federal level, and we've got two categories of spending in the United States, two categories: national defense and everything else. And that's how big national defense is. We're closing on $1 trillion of spending per year, every year on national defense. And that's an issue where there's typically no non-excludability. We're all sort of theoretically protected by having the U.S. Navy and Marines and all of that to defend us. And there's no real rival. We don't have, even though we've got different branches, yes, I know, there's rivalry between them. Even in that area, the government's trying to take down some of those rivalries because they think those are a little bit difficult. But here, rivalry for, Idaho is not any better protected than Wyoming is by the U.S. Air Force, for instance. They're not paying any more, they're not getting any better benefits, so it's not excludable. That's a non-rival proposition. Okay, so national defense. This is particularly important in the United States because for those people who have challenged the amount of spending, and there are a lot of people who think we spend way too much on national defense. So the $25 trillion economy, we spend about $1 trillion on things like uniformed services and Air Force bases around the world and military bases, and you name it, it goes on and on. A lot of people think those resources could be diverted elsewhere. That's a debate. That's a political debate. That's something that's probably worthwhile to have. But nonetheless, our purpose here is just simply describing what they are. So national defense, I'm no better protected by the fact that we've got an Army and Navy than what you are. And there's no rivalrous, even if I pay more in taxes, Bill Gates is probably in no better shape than what any of us are from having an army. Okay. I'm sure pays higher taxes than all of us. Okay. All right. So those are the two ones that we sort of laid out at the beginning. Now we've got a couple of oddballs, and we need to talk about those because they're a little bit less obvious. And the first of these look a lot like public goods, but they're non-rival, and that they are nonetheless they're non-excludable. So they're they're rival. They're rival. They're not excludable. I have one quadrant here. And these are what are called common goods. Okay, so let's talk about common goods. They look a lot like public goods, but they're not. Okay, so these are common goods. These are goods which are rival, that is, one person can use the good at a given time, but they're non-excludable. Okay, so let's talk about some examples of these goods that are typically not the case that they're rival and non-excludable. And so some of these are a little bit difficult to get our arms around, and some of these might look a little bit trivial, but I'm going to take these trivial examples and say that they've got sort of a non-trivial nature. Let's take one particular example. That would be something like library books. Okay, I'm talking about public library. If I check out a book from the library, there's no cost to me, but it's rival in the sense that as long as I have it, it's mine for the 2 weeks or whatever until I take it back. If it belongs to somebody else and then becomes rival to them, but it's not excludable. I don't pay to go to the public library. I simply have to show my ID or whatever, and I get a card. I can check things out. So library books or any kind of materials from the library would be an example of goods which are considered to be non-rival, but non-excludable. Also things like hunting and fishing, okay? Hunting and fishing and the output of those. And also the idea of if I shoot a deer, it's my deer, right? And I didn't have to pay for the deer, but it is rival in the sense that it's the deer that I shot, my deer, it's my fish that I caught and whatnot. And by the way, I know that sometimes people will sort of say, okay, but what about the licenses? Because you typically have to have a hunting license or a fishing license. How do you say that that's not excludable because you have to pay for those? Well, that's true, but it's really more tax that doesn't go anywhere other than the fact of the government. Because let's say I get a fishing license and I catch no fish. In other words, I've made an expenditure. I get nothing in return for it. I just get the opportunity to fish. I can't go back to the government and say, hey, you know what? I didn't catch any fish. I get a refund. I'm sure the answer is going to be no to that because you're not paying for fish, you're paying for the right to do that. So if I catch a fish, it becomes non-excludable, non-rival. Now, these might sound a little, I'm sorry, rival, but non-excludable. It can include also things which, things like picnic tables at parks, right? Again, these sound kind of trivial, but maybe they're not quite as trivial as before, okay? Now, here's where we get a little bit, so if you might say, okay, picnic tables, library books, whatever, okay? This is the best you got. Well, okay, let's maybe amp it up a little bit here and talk about things like mineral rights. Now we're starting to talk about areas where it becomes a little bit more dicey. And that is the idea that if I'm drilling for oil somewhere in international waters, for instance, it's rival in the sense that this is whatever oil I get is my oil, but I'm not paying for the right to do that. I simply have the ability to go into it because whoever gets to the oil first is whoever gets to the oil first. We're talking more sort of internationally than anywhere else, but there also is a dimension, even domestically, when we talk about things like mineral rights, who gets the right to mine, who gets the right to fish, and also we could also say along with this would be things like timber rights, because a lot of the land in the U.S., particularly the U.S., is owned by the government, so they simply lease the land for mineral rights and for timber rights, where whoever's got the rights has the exclusive use of that. And I don't mean exclusive to be confused with non-excludable. It's the idea they've got the right to do it. They pay a certain a fee to the government in order to do that. Internationally, though, which is where it gets a little bit more interesting, is who owns the oil underneath the Gulf of Mexico, 500 miles out from Miami? Who owns it? Well, everybody and nobody. That's really the idea of common goods, is that who owns the fish in the Jemez River? Everybody and really nobody. And so as a result, who is able to get it? Who owns the library books? Everybody and nobody. That's really what the nature of common goods is. This idea there's a rivalry aspect. So they look a lot like public goods, but they're not because of this rivalrous aspect that does not exist in the other category. Okay. All right. So questions about common goods and how they are a little bit different here. Okay, well, then the final one is the output of natural monopolies. This is one that probably is a little bit more unusual, and one that I think maybe you didn't expect to see as common, that we were done with natural monopolies. Maybe not. So the output of natural monopolies, these are goods that are, in this case, non-rival goods, but they're excludable. Okay, non-rival, but they're excludable. And they include the case in which there's one provider of the good. And we said that what's one reason why there's one provider of the goods is because we're trying to sort of capture, it only makes sense sometimes, or sometimes there's a built-in sort of protection for that. And if we talk about the output of natural monopolies, what are we really talking about here? It could be things like this. It could be increasingly, this is a big area right now, intellectual property law. It would include something like the use of software, okay? Use of software, where these are goods which are excludable. You've got to pay for it to the extent that they can prevent you from using it, but it's non-rival in nature. And so software tends to be a proprietary type of product. And by the way, this is a fairly new area. I guess maybe it sort of contradicts what I said earlier in the class, where you could pick up an 80s textbook from micro and it'd be pretty much the same. Well, this is an area that's not, but this is, again, this falls into market failure, and so that area is changing. I know in macroeconomics, we used to not even account for the value of software when it was first produced. It used to just be dumped in the value of hardware because software is not usable unless there's hardware to run it. So it was just sort of included in that. As it turns out, the software business now is far larger than the hardware business, which is kind of not such a great business. Actually, it's kind of almost a commodity business. You can get a computer for very little. It's the software that is the real value. And so again, these are excludable. You have to pay for it, but they're non-rival. We can all be running Microsoft Windows. There's no limitation on our ability to use that. Also things, and this is a little bit more controversial, and sometimes there has been a disagreement on this one, but things like cable TV. Cable TV companies have long ago sort of staked out territory, and they got the protection of the federal government to allow them in certain areas to have primarily a natural monopoly in certain areas, not nationwide, certainly, because we have different providers. Comcast does not provide cable to every place, not even in Albuquerque, but in certain areas. And part of this is a logical issue of how many fiber optic cables you want being strung along through the ground and whatnot. So, but cable TV obviously is good, you have to pay for it. Again, if you steal cable TV, you know, then that's another issue. That does not make the good not excludable. It just simply means you're stealing something. So cable TV would be one particular example of that. These are the output of natural monopolies. Also, things like public utilities. Now, we've already covered this, and so this doesn't really need to be discussed. And so public utilities are those goods which we still have to pay for. We have to pay for electricity. We have to pay for water. The fact that we call them public kind of means that they almost have a public sector sort of nature, but they are excludable. They're not public goods because we have to pay for water, electricity, natural gas, and whatnot. So if we go home tonight and we all take a shower, right? The fact that I take a shower does not prevent anybody else from taking a shower. You're not being kicked out. Now, I suppose if everybody in town did at the same time, then we probably have a technical issue, but that doesn't redefine the type of good that it is. It's a good that's non-rival. I don't kick anybody out. If I go home or if we go home and we all turn on CBS, right? The fact is somebody doesn't get knocked off CBS and gets on to Nickelodeon because, hey, too many people on CBS, right? It's a non-rival good, but it's a good that we tend to have to pay for it. So and cable might actually be sort of a euphemism for cable TV and streaming and satellite. And I think satellite is probably the better connection to that. You know, you get that kind of thing going. Streaming is a little bit difficult because now you've really got competition going on, so it becomes a little bit difficult to make that leap. Okay, same with electricity. If I go home and I turn my lights on, it doesn't mean somebody else's lights get turned off, and I have to pay for the lights. If I choose not to pay, they choose not to provide that to me. Okay, all right. So this is sort of an example of what these goods are and why they're important, and it sort of brings us into the realm of saying, hey, not all goods are private goods. And in fact, it's an area in which we need to sort of circle back to the motivations of sellers in the first place, and that is why people do what they do. And when we talked about this idea of maximized behavior, we're saying, okay, well, the reason people do what they do is because they're maximize their behavior. To the extent that the good has a private dimension, they're trying to maximize profit. To the extent that there's a public dimension, they seek to maximize some sort of welfare to the public. And in fact, a lot of these have government provision, right? Library books tend to be public sector type issues, right? Most anybody can walk into the library. There's no checking to make sure that you paid your tax or whatever, those kinds of things. But obviously, these sort of more trivial examples do have real life and big time examples when it comes to things like mineral rights, timber rights, etc. Okay, all right. So questions about any of that? So I know I spent some time talking about that. I think it's important. That sort of does it for the last bit of the market failure bit that I want to go in. We'll again, market failure is a topic we'll return to again. We're particularly going to come back to it when we get into chapter 16, and we're going to talk more about information failures. And I think you might find that to be pretty interesting because it sort of turns what's known as classical economics on its head. That is the original set of thinking about how the original ideas of economics that said that, hey, buyers and sellers make mistakes, but they're pretty good at figuring out when they made a mistake because they can get adequate information to determine whether a good is what it's cracked up to be. Not always, because there's some goods that are too complicated really for most buyers. More on that a bit later. Okay, so we talked about types of goods. We talked about that, and we talked a bit about free ridership. Any question about free ridership? And I want to make sure that we're all familiar with it. That's a term that we hear again and again and again, this idea of free ridership. And yet sometimes it's not well defined, at least in my opinion, it's not always well defined. And it sometimes leads people to get the idea that when somebody up to no good, that's really not what is going on. Okay. All right. Well, let's move. Let me sort of circle back to chapter 4. Now, I know that we skipped over last time for reasons I talked about earlier. You can read that chapter. I would just read just a labor piece if you're going to do that, but I'm going to cover really the highlights, what I think is important. And then chapter 14, I didn't think it's prudent to get into 14 unless we sort of covered some of these fundamentals really of the labor market. So again, I want to get very, very basic here. And I want to talk about this idea of almost some of the most basic idea of economics is this idea that what the sellers do is they corral inputs. Okay. And I probably have drawn this little spreadsheet before. They sort of draw these inputs together. They run them through the production process, right? So production, and out the other end come outputs. We have these nice shiny little boxes and come in the mail, come in Amazon, or you get them in the store or whatever. So you've got inputs that are being corralled to produce outputs. Okay. So, and that's what the production process is. It's done at the level of the firm. And I think when we talk about firms, we're talking about the business firm as that one entity that's really responsible for producing most of the economic value in the economy. And don't take my word for it. If you simply look at the total output of goods and services, you'll see that government spending is several $1 trillion, but it's massively overwhelmed by spending on other spending, which in production of other goods by other producers that are non-governmental. So it's all the other stuff that we buy, airplanes and food and clothing and all that. So the firm has got an indispensable role. And so the firm now has got a different kind of role. Now remember, one of these inputs that we talked about was labor, okay? But it's not just labor. Remember, we had the factors of production, land, labor, capital, and all that. And I won't go into that again, but I do want to focus on this idea of labor as an input. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to sort of flip the script a little bit, because up to this point, we're talking about outputs as Q or total product, whichever you prefer. Yeah, and that is in fact what's the case. But here we talked about the thing, we talked about the price of the good, we were talking about the price of the output. Here we want to talk about the market for inputs. Okay, so and specifically the input that we're going to talk about is the quantity of labor. Now I know chapter 4 and certainly, well, chapter 4, but also 14 get into this idea of talking about the quantity of other inputs like machinery and whatnot. And I think that's a little bit more than what I want to do in this class, because I know I've taught 300 level econ micro before. It really sort of looks a little bit more like that. If anybody's interested in that, you can take a 300 level class. I think it's a little bit more complicated and it doesn't do a very good job of talking about it. So we're going to talk about the market for input, that's labor. So we're talking about the quantity of labor. Then we're talking about the price. The price of labor is simply the wage. Okay? Price of labor is simply the wage. In the most basic conception then of what this looks like, we've got a supply of labor here. We'll call it supply of labor. But this is not supply of labor by firms. This is supply of labor by households or the individual members of households. And so that's a little bit different than what we talked about before. Because here we're talking about the household as being a supplier of labor. In other words, we're flipping the sketch, we're flipping it around because we're not talking about outputs, we're talking about the market for inputs. And you've got demand for labor. The demand for labor is not by firms here. I'm sorry, by households here. Demand is not household demand, it's by its firms. And so the actors are reversed. Now, remember, there was a reason back in second week of class, third week of class, whenever we talked about economic actors. So I said, I like the term actor because it sort of describes different roles that different actors play. So particularly the two actors in the private sector, and that is households and firms. We said that between 9 and 5, household could be a provider of labor. Okay. So your role as an actor is a worker, and after 5 o'clock, your role is as a consumer. So you're changing roles. But likewise, firms can play different roles as well. Not only they're producers of goods, but they're also employers of labor. So they have demand for labor. Okay, so the supply and demand are just simply being reversed here. But yet, like most markets that have these kind of relationships here, you can determine a wage, and the wage is simply an equilibrium wage for whatever particular labor market this is. And again, I kind of come back to this idea that we talked about a number of times in this class, and that is the idea in micro, what really differentiates microeconomics from macro is the idea that we can zoom in and zoom out, depending on how tightly we want to view and construe a market, or we can zoom out and we can make it a bigger conception. Again, we can talk about the demand for shoes in Albuquerque, the demand for shoes in Albuquerque, demand for shoes for households between San and Tramway and Ventura and Montgomery. I mean, whatever kind of bracketing you want to say, you can even get it tighter than that, or you can zoom back out. So zooming in, zooming out. So whatever this market is, it could be the market for pipe fitters in Santa Fe, right? I don't know if that's much of a market, but you get the idea. And so as a result, there's demand for labor by employers, supply of labor by workers, and there's some sort of wage. And we're going to say that in most cases, this wage is primarily market determined. Okay, and if you have any doubt about the fact that wages are primarily market determined, then look what's happening at the moment, where we've got really wages beginning to rise, in particular for entry-level workers, to the point where they're many times, much higher than what they would have been otherwise. In fact, much higher than minimum wage. And we'll talk about minimum wage. I don't think we'll get to that today, but we will talk a bit about minimum wage and what that's all about. Okay. All right. So this is not anything too radical and too different here. And so, but just like the case in which you've got in the demand for outputs, where you've got demand for labor and supply of labor, you could have, demand for goods and supply of goods. You can have a shift in the demand for labor. And so as a result, you've got a rightward shift. Remember, right as opposed to up and down. So you've got a rightward shift, and that is that maybe now quantity of labor demand has risen now for whatever reason. So there's an increase in demand for in the demand for labor for whatever purpose. Why would that be the case? And by the way, when there's an increase in demand for labor, we simply see typically an increase in the wage paid to that labor. Just like in the output market, nothing terribly different as to how this works. If demanders, that is business firms and all employers really want more laborers for the particular wage given, then they'll demand more of it. And we'll talk about what some of the reasons are for that, okay? Because it's an important thing and it tends to drive the wage up. Okay, so movements along these demand and supply curves are due to changes in the wage itself. And it's shifts that are really what we want to talk about. So remember, if we go back to chapter 3, I know it's been a while, but it's particularly useful because we sort of got into the dynamics of markets in general, and we focused primarily on output markets. Excuse me, now we're talking primarily here about input markets. And so, but again, sliding up and down along the demand curve or the supply curve is simply due to the price of the good, okay? Well, and in this case, the price of the good, the price of the output is labor. Households provide labor as their output. And so as a result, the supply side, which I know a lot of people want to view as simply as firms, but the supply side also includes households as well, okay? So let's talk about this idea of what could cause shifts in demand, okay? And again, I'll put this on PowerPoint, just moving some things around. I think the file I have and I wanted to sort of add to this was a little bit corrupt, and I think I wanted to sort of reboot that. So let's talk about what can cause shifts in demand, okay?
I think you have to change the camera.
What's that?
Camera.
Oh, not to, okay. Oh, you're right. Thank you for pointing that out. Sometimes I'm sensitive to that. So, oh, no, I didn't. I think I'm good. I'm good. Okay. Oh, no, I'm not good. No, you're right. Thank you. Okay. All right. So hopefully everyone got that on the basic supply demand. And now we're talking now about what can cause shifts in demand for labor. Okay. So shifts in demand for labor. So what are the causal factors? In other words, what are the determinant of these shifts? Okay, demand for labor. And again, we're talking about here, just like we were talking about non-price variables, these are non-wage variables. Non-wage variables. And so in the case of employers that want to hire more workers, okay, for whatever reason, they want to hire more hours to be employed, more people, whatever this quantity of labor is, as long as you're consistent in the model here, it could be the number of hours worked, it could be the quantity of labor, it could be the number of workers per 8-hour shift, it could be the number of workers for 40 hours, it could be entire work units, okay? And if they're demanding more, it's not because of the wage. In fact, they're going to pay a higher wage, which kind of goes against what firms really like to do, and that's pay higher wages. I think that's pretty obvious, though. I mean, firms would prefer not to pay higher wages, but sometimes they have to, particularly when there are other issues. And so what are some of the determinants here? Well, the first one is the idea of the idea that labor is a derived demand. So it's derived from the demand for the output itself. Okay. So whatever the employment is engaged in doing, it has an impact on the demand for labor. So derived from the demand for the output itself, whatever the output is. So if construction is going big guns, for various reasons, and the demand for construction workers is going to go up, and the wages paid to construction workers is going to go up. And we certainly saw that happen during the big boom in housing and the run up to the financial crisis. We saw lots and lots of housing everywhere, all across the country, just booming. And in fact, there were very few construction workers who didn't have jobs, and a lot of them were moving around to try to find jobs itself. And so if there was demand for the good itself, if it's rising, there's going to be demand for the labor itself, and it goes vice versa. If in fact it's taking construction as was one example that sort of shows this in both directions, we saw demand for housing fall, new construction fall, and demand for construction workers go down, simply because the fact that the market had sort of reached its peak and sort of the air got let out of the market for real estate. So labor is always a derived demand, but so is demand for other inputs. It's just that we're not going to give them those other inputs because I think it's a little bit beyond where we want to go. So it's derived from the demand for the good itself, whatever that case in point is. And there are some areas of this that are very sort of built into the economy itself that are probably for the foreseeable future going to have a rise in demand for the particular workers because the demand for the output itself is increasing. And I'm thinking healthcare in particular. And I know that there are a lot of people who have left other occupations to go into healthcare work because it's probably, even if you're 20 years old, I think it's probably in the foreseeable future, you probably will have employment, assuming you're employable for probably your entire career, because the huge demand for healthcare, and because of the huge demand for healthcare, the huge demand for healthcare workers. And at the same time that people are jumping into that to take advantage of the demand, people are also leaving because, you know, we're also having this bulge in the population where the quote unquote baby boomers are beginning to retire. And I'm sort of on the very tail end of that, but I'm not quite, because I'm on the tail end, I'm not quite the retirement part of it. But you get the idea, some of these are structural and built in for a long time. As opposed to something like construction, it's much more cyclical. It's up, it's down, it's up and down. If anybody has known people working in construction, you know, they sometimes are all over the place. And sometimes they like that kind of work, other times not. The other example I can think of that's very cyclical is just a few years ago when the oil price was rebounding worldwide. We saw oil go over $100 a barrel. It's around 70 now, so it was much, much higher. And so there's lots of drilling going on in the United States. And workers were going in droves to these areas to get jobs working in oil wells, particularly in this part of the oil business called fracking, where it's called hydraulic fracturing. And they had little RV communities and tent communities that people built up. These weren't homeless people, these were workers who were simply going there in order to capture higher wages because the demand for oil was so high. It made the demand for labor higher. With the pandemic, everything reversed itself. And that's another example of the fact that these dynamics that go up, they go out to the right, and they go to the left, right, left. And so there are a lot of markets that are very unstable. And so we see this happening all the time. There's very much instability in there. What are some other areas that cause demand for labor? Number one, there is a necessity for certain skills. Okay, and I'm going to sort of put skills and education together here. Sometimes there are jobs that simply now require people to have a certain amount of background in order to do the job. Okay, certain skills jobs. We saw this happening in the mortgage business prior to the financial crisis. It seemed like everybody and their brother could go into the mortgage business and either start a firm or become a loan officer. Very little training. You know, in Colorado, for instance, we had some, when I was still in banking, we had a lot of clients that were mortgage companies in Colorado. Some of them were just working from their home. It was no more difficult to get a license than to simply mail it into the state and get the state to mail it back to you. And so you're a mortgage company. And hire workers, no skills and training, but now those requirements have gone up. And so as a result, now it has really affected demand because now there's less demand overall. And because of that, there's you know, these are not as lucrative a position as they once were. Education the same way. Sometimes there's a necessity for people with certain amounts of education. Certain occupations have raised educational requirements beyond what they were before, and so it influences demand for goods or for the inputs. Accountants are one example. Today, to be a CPA, I think in every state you have to have 150 hours of college education, and that did not used to be the case. And so as a result, this is also a supply issue, but we're talking here about demand. There's a demand for fewer of them, simply, and obviously it's met by supply ship on the downside as well. But there's a demand for fewer of them because of the fact that it's an extra requirement that is not necessarily always needed. Okay, there are a couple others as well. And one of these I'm going to talk about. And this will be it. I know we're about out of time, and everyone's getting restless here. So, and that is government regulation. Sometimes government regulation requires that you have to have workers with certain skills, and so you have to have certain numbers of people to do certain things. So, for instance, it may be required that a school district have a number of licensed psychologists or therapists of some sort to deal with student issues and whatnot. So, as a result, government mandate is that there's that certain number of occupations be filled. So, demand is a result of that. Again, all demand is really a derived demand. In this sense, though, it's created by government itself. Okay. All right. Well, that's a pretty good stopping point. I've got just a couple more line items on demand. Any questions for me about any of this? And I'll pick it up with supply on Wednesday, and then we'll get into some of the dynamics in chapter 14. So you all make that.